In the harrowing spring of 1940, with the shadow of the swastika stretching across mainland Europe and the remnants of the British Expeditionary Force being plucked from the beaches of Dunkirk, Great Britain stood alone, bracing for an imminent invasion. The island nation, facing the full might of the seemingly invincible Wehrmacht, was gripped by a mixture of fear and defiant resolve. It was in this crucible of national peril that one of history's most remarkable civilian armies was forged, a force that would become both a symbol of British tenacity and an unexpected thorn in the side of the Luftwaffe. This was the birth of the Home Guard. The official call to arms came on the evening of May 14, 1940. In a now famous radio broadcast, Secretary of State for War, Sir Anthony Eden, spoke to the nation. He called upon all men between the ages of 17 and 65, who were not already engaged in military service, to become local defense volunteers, or LDV. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, 250,000 men had put their names forward. By the end of 1940, this volunteer force had swelled to an astonishing 1.5 million members, representing nearly a fifth of the country's male population. It was a mass mobilization of a kind rarely seen, a spontaneous uprising of citizens determined to defend their homeland. The composition of this new force was as eclectic as it was spirited. It was an army of men deemed either too young or too old for the regular army, whose enlistment age was between 18 and 41. It included farmers, factory workers, clerks, teachers, and shopkeepers who held reserved occupations vital to the war effort. Because the majority of its fighting units were composed of men over the age of 40, many of them veterans of the Great War, the public affectionately, and accurately, nicknamed them Dad's Army. While women were not officially permitted to join, their determination to contribute was irrepressible, leading to the formation of unofficial auxiliary organizations like the Women's Home Defense, WHD, proving that the will to resist was universal. Initially, this citizen army was an army in name only. For the first few months, its members had no uniforms, their only mark of identification being a simple armband, often handmade, with the letters LDV printed upon it. Proper uniforms would only arrive later. The issue of weaponry was even more critical. With the regular army having abandoned much of its equipment at Dunkirk, the LDV were armed with whatever could be spared. This meant a motley collection of obsolete arms, old Lee Enfield rifles from the turn of the century, Lewis machine guns from the First World War, personal hunting shotguns, pistols, and even agricultural implements like pitchforks and scythes. Yet, behind this amateur facade was a surprisingly professional and radical strategic concept. The intellectual father of the organization was Captain Tom Wintringham, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War. Having witnessed the effectiveness of guerrilla tactics firsthand, Wintringham had published a book titled, How to Reform the Army, back in 1937, advocating for a more adaptable and unconventional fighting force. His ideas shaped the Home Guard's doctrine. They were not intended to fight pitched battles against German panzers but to be a decentralized resistance network. In preparation for a potential invasion, units began creating secret arms caches in forests, bunkers, and cellars, a guerrilla warfare technique that would later be adopted by Allied stay-behind networks like Operation Gladio. To the German High Command, observing from across the Channel, this Dad's Army was a source of derision. Some Luftwaffe officers dismissed it as a theatrical army, a pathetic symbol of British desperation rather than a genuine combat force. They saw pictures of old men with ancient rifles and believed it was a bluff. Within Britain, however, a different legend was taking hold. For the British people, the Home Guard was the ultimate line of defense, the embodiment of Churchill's promise to fight on the beaches, fight in the fields and in the streets. They were the ordinary men who would stand fast when all else had failed. Imagine a tranquil English village, deep in the countryside. On a riverbank, a 60-year-old man, his face etched with memories of the Somme, cradles a rifle of 1904 vintage. On his arm, a crudely marked LDV armband. Beside him stands a 17-year-old boy, the weight of his newly issued rifle still unfamiliar in his hands, looking at his older comrade with a sense of awe. If the Germans come, we'll meet them right here, the veteran says, his gaze fixed on the low, gray sky from which the German planes would soon appear. It was this quiet, unyielding spirit that the Luftwaffe commanders failed to comprehend until bullets from the ground began to fly. As the summer of 1940 reached its zenith, the skies over southern England became the stage for one of history's most decisive military campaigns. The Battle of Britain was not merely a series of aerial engagements, it was the essential prelude to Hitler's planned invasion, Operation Sea Lion. To cross the English Channel, the Wehrmacht needed air supremacy. The Luftwaffe's primary objective was brutally simple: to seek out and destroy the Royal Air Force, both in the air and on the ground. This context of a nation under relentless aerial assault is crucial to understanding how and why the civilian Home Guard would soon find themselves on the front lines. The battle is considered to have begun on July 10, 1940. In this initial phase, the Luftwaffe focused its attacks on British shipping convoys in the Channel and on coastal towns and port facilities. The strategy was to draw RAF Fighter Command into a battle of attrition, bleeding its resources and testing its defenses. The intensity of these clashes escalated dramatically through July and into August, as the Luftwaffe shifted its focus inland, targeting RAF airfields, command centers, and the critical radar installations of the Chain-Home system. The fighting reached a terrifying crescendo on August 18, a date that would be seared into the memory of both sides as the hardest day. On this single day, the Luftwaffe launched approximately 970 sorties against Britain. The ensuing combat was ferocious and costly. While the RAF suffered significant losses, the Luftwaffe was staggered, losing between 60 and 71 aircraft and, critically, 94 pilots killed or captured. The strain on German resources was becoming apparent. Throughout August, their fighter production barely kept pace with losses. For every 160 aircraft shot down, only 173 new ones were delivered from the factories. The period from late August to early September represented the most critical phase for Fighter Command. With its airfields under constant bombardment and its pilots stretched to the breaking point, the RAF was on the verge of collapse. Yet, unbeknownst to the German High Command, Britain's industrial might was outperforming Germany's. In 1940, Great Britain produced 15,049 aircraft to Germany's 10,826. This industrial advantage, bolstered by the arrival of at least 400 new fighters from the United States, was just enough to keep the RAF in the fight. For the German pilots, the experience was profoundly unsettling. They had entered the battle with a sense of invincibility after their swift victories across Europe. But Britain was different. They began to speak of a mysterious British advantage, with rumors circulating that the English used some kind of magic system to intercept their formations. Luftwaffe pilots complained that, whenever they flew day or night, fighters were always there to intercept them. This magic was, of course, the world's first integrated air defense system, combining radar, ground observers, and centralized command and control, which allowed the RAF to scramble its fighters with deadly precision. A phrase began to circulate among the German air crews, a sentiment born of frustration and a growing sense of unease: "They are shooting at us with everything that shoots." On September 7, frustrated by the RAF's refusal to break, the Luftwaffe made a fateful strategic error. It shifted the focus of its daylight attacks from RAF infrastructure to the City of London itself, beginning the Blitz. While this brought terror to the civilian population, it gave Fighter Command a desperately needed respite to repair its airfields and regroup. The climax of the daylight campaign came on September 15, now commemorated as Battle of Britain Day, when nearly 1,500 aircraft clashed in the skies over London in a massive aerial battle. The Luftwaffe suffered unsustainable losses, effectively ending its hopes of achieving daytime air superiority. By the end of the battle, the Luftwaffe's total losses would amount to a staggering 1,733 aircraft. By September, its operational strength had been whittled down to 721 single-engine fighters, 181 twin-engine fighters, and 401 dive bombers. Let us picture the sky over the Thames on August 18, 1940. A Heinkel He-111 bomber, trailing smoke, spirals down from a great height, a British fighter hot on its tail. Inside the cockpit, the German crew commander grips his controls, his knuckles white. Below him, the patchwork of English fields and small towns rushes up to meet him. And then he sees it. Flashes from the ground. Muzzle flashes. Gunfire. It's not coming from military anti-aircraft batteries, but from the very ground itself. From ordinary people. From old men. A grimace that is half smile, half snarl, twists the German pilot's mouth. This is not funny. This is terrifying. While the epic dogfights between Spitfires and Messerschmitts dominated the official narrative of the Battle of Britain, a second, far more unconventional war was beginning to unfold on the ground. As the conflict intensified, a spontaneous and largely undocumented form of resistance emerged from the fields, villages, and rooftops of southern England. This was the moment when civilians and the fledgling Home Guard, armed with little more than conviction and a motley collection of firearms, began to shoot back. The first reports of this phenomenon were not found in official military dispatches but in the scattered accounts of eyewitnesses and the bewildered reports of Luftwaffe pilots. From the outset, the primary weapons of this citizen army were the venerable .303 Lee Enfield rifle and the First World War-era Lewis machine gun, supplemented by privately owned hunting shotguns. Initially, the very idea of engaging a state-of-the-art fighting aircraft with such weaponry seemed an act of pure desperation. Yet, the tactical realities of the air war created unexpected opportunities. The German Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, in particular, proved to be highly vulnerable. During the critical moments when a Stuka would pull out of its steep dive, its speed would drop significantly, presenting a brief but viable target for disciplined ground fire. It was in these fleeting seconds that the men on the ground had their chance. Soon, official Luftwaffe field reports began to contain unsettling references to small arms fire originating from the ground during low-altitude attacks. At first, these were dismissed as anomalies. But as the incidents grew, they began to fuel a potent mix of rumors and legends within the German squadrons. One of the most persistent tales told of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 being brought down in the county of Somerset, not by a Spitfire or a Hurricane, but by a single Lewis gun that a local Home Guard unit had audaciously mounted on a barn roof. This notion that the very landscape had become hostile was crystallizing in the minds of German airmen. The phrase, rumored to have originated in a pilot's exasperated letter to his squadron commander, began to circulate. The British were firing on them with everything that shoots. The sentiment captured a growing paranoia. The stories became more elaborate, more fantastical. Some pilots swore that in certain rural districts, they had been fired upon by hunting crossbows. An even more potent legend was that of the granny with a shotgun, a mythical figure who, depending on the telling, had single-handedly shot down 2 German fighters with her hunting piece. She became a folkloric bogeyman for the Luftwaffe, a symbol of the seemingly irrational and total nature of British resistance. For historians, separating fact from fiction remains a significant challenge. The tangible impact of this civilian ground fire is a matter of debate. Some scholars maintain that its successes were minimal and that the stories were largely a product of wartime propaganda and rumor. Others argue that, while confirmed kills are nearly impossible to verify, it is highly probable that at least a few German aircraft sustained significant damage from this hail of bullets from below. The combat reports of the Luftwaffe itself provide a middle ground. They contain numerous mentions of unexpected ground fire, but its precise origin and effectiveness were often difficult for the pilots to ascertain in the heat of combat. Ultimately, the true power of this ground-level opposition was not measured in downed aircraft, but in its profound psychological impact. For a Luftwaffe pilot, trained to fight a three-dimensional war in the sky, the idea of being targeted by a farmer in a field or a clerk on a rooftop was deeply unnerving. It shattered the illusion of a sterile, technological conflict, replacing it with the unsettling reality of a total war, where every village could be a fortress and every citizen a potential enemy. Imagine the countryside of Kent in the sweltering heat of August 1940. 3 young Home Guard volunteers, an electrician, a schoolteacher, and a local forester hear the predatory roar of a German fighter's engine. It is flying low, dangerously low, strafing a nearby road. Now, their section leader shouts. They raise their rifles, the taste of fear and adrenaline sharp in their mouths. The first shot cracks through the air, then the second, the third. The fighter, a fleeting shadow, seems to bank slightly, altering its course before disappearing over the horizon. They will never know if any of their bullets found their mark. But in that moment, something inside them changed. They were no longer helpless civilians cowering under the bombs, they were combatants, units of resistance in the defense of their homes. As the scattered anecdotes of ground fire began to coalesce into a recognized phenomenon, both British civilians and the German High Command attempted to understand its scope and nature. Moving beyond individual stories, a clearer pattern of this unconventional resistance started to emerge, defined by its geography, its weaponry, and the specific vulnerabilities it exploited. While precise, verifiable statistics remain elusive, a systematic look at the available evidence reveals a surprisingly organized and persistent threat. The incidents were not random events occurring across the whole of the British Isles. Instead, they were heavily concentrated in the geographical corridor that bore the brunt of the Luftwaffe's offensive, the southeastern counties of England. Reports of ground fire were most frequent in Kent, Surrey, Somerset, and Dorset. This was no coincidence. These regions lay directly under the primary flight paths for German bombers and their fighter escorts heading towards London and the critical RAF airfields. For the Home Guard units and armed civilians in these areas, the war was not a distant event heard on the radio, it was a daily reality passing directly over their heads, often at low altitudes, making engagement not just possible, but almost inevitable. The arsenal for this citizens' war was, by necessity, a diverse and improvised one. The standard issue weapons remained the .303 caliber Lee Enfield rifle and the formidable, if antiquated, Lewis machine gun. These were supplemented by privately owned hunting shotguns, which, while limited in range, could be effective against low-flying targets. However, the inventory often expanded to include what could only be described as weapons from impure sources. Home Guard units eagerly took possession of captured German small arms, pressed into service rifles from the First World War, and in some cases, even utilized high-powered sporting rifles. This ad hoc armory was a testament to the British public's resourcefulness and determination to use any means necessary. The effectiveness of these weapons was greatly enhanced by the specific tactics of the Luftwaffe. The Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber, a terrifying symbol of the Blitzkrieg, became the most frequent victim of ground fire. Its famous dive bombing attack profile contained a fatal flaw. Upon pulling out of its dive, the aircraft was slow, relatively low to the ground, and highly predictable in its flight path. This made it the perfect target for coordinated fire from the ground, a brief window where even rifle-caliber bullets could inflict critical damage on its engine, control surfaces, or pilot. This was not merely random, pot-shot firing. In some districts, local ingenuity led to the formation of organized ambush groups. These teams would study the routes of returning German aircraft and position themselves along these flight paths to maximize their chances of a successful engagement. This grassroots tactical thinking was further evidenced by reports of the same German pilot being fired upon in the exact same location on multiple occasions over a period of days. In the rural countryside, this grim task even took on a competitive, almost sporting, dimension. A macabre lottery system emerged in some villages, where residents would place wagers on who would be the first to land a definitive hit on an enemy aircraft. Quantifying the success of these efforts is where fact blurs into the fog of war. The numbers that exist are largely based on rumor and intelligence estimates. One such rumor, circulating in late 1940, suggested that there had been as many as 47 documented contacts between the Home Guard and the Luftwaffe during the month of November alone. Another unconfirmed but persistent report claimed that at least 3 to 5 German aircraft had suffered serious damage as a direct result of ground fire from non-military sources. While these figures cannot be definitively proven, they fueled a perception of potent resistance, a perception best summarized by a half-joking, half-fearful anecdote that became popular among German pilots. In England, every 10th peasant is a sniper. Imagine a German intelligence officer's room. On a large table, a map of southeastern England is covered with red pins, each one marking a reported incident of ground fire. The officer tries to draw lines, to find a pattern, a command structure, a logic he can counter. But there is none. The pins are scattered across villages, farms, and coastal fields. The attacks are unpredictable, decentralized, and seemingly everywhere at once. He stares at the map, and a chilling realization dawns on him: the enemy is everywhere, and the enemy is nowhere. The initial reaction of the Luftwaffe to the concept of Britain's Home Guard was one of arrogant amusement. To the battle-hardened veterans of the campaigns in Poland and France, the idea of middle-aged men with antique rifles posing any real threat was laughable. They were, in the Germans' eyes, a theatrical army, a desperate and pathetic propaganda exercise. However, as the Battle of Britain raged on, this derision slowly but surely began to curdle into a genuine and pervasive sense of concern. The persistent, unpredictable nature of ground fire began to inflict a kind of psychological damage that was far more significant than the physical toll on aircraft. This transformation was not the result of a single decisive event, but a slow erosion of confidence. For a German pilot, the sky was his domain, a battlefield with known rules and identifiable adversaries. The ground, however, was supposed to be a neutral backdrop. The introduction of fire from below fundamentally changed this dynamic. It meant that danger was no longer confined to enemy fighters appearing on his six. Now, it could come from any field, any village, any rooftop he passed over. The battlefield had become total and 360 degrees. This growing anxiety is reflected in the private writings and memoirs of German airmen. Wilfried Jonen, a Luftwaffe pilot, noted in his diary the sheer tenacity of his opponents, observing, "The English fought not only with their aircraft, but also with their own fear. They grabbed any weapon that fell into their hands." Another bomber crew member later wrote of his astonishment at the British resolve, "After the defeat in France, we expected the English to raise their hands. But even their farmers fought against us." This sentiment was echoed in rumors that filtered up to German headquarters, painting a picture of a nation utterly unified in its defiance. In England, every village is a fortress. This psychological pressure soon translated into tangible tactical shifts. By September 1940, the cumulative effect of pilot anxiety and minor but consistent aircraft damage could no longer be ignored. In a move that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring issued a directive urging a reduction in low-flying attack activity, with the explicit goal of preserving his pilots. German squadron commanders, acting on this directive and their own experiences, began to alter their mission plans. Low-level strafing and bombing runs, once a staple of Luftwaffe tactics, became increasingly rare. The fear of this ubiquitous fire had a direct impact on operational readiness. In a remarkable development, some Luftwaffe pilots reportedly began refusing to fly missions over specific areas known for particularly intense ground fire. These informally redlined zones became no-go areas, tangible proof that the "Dad's Army" was now a factor in German operational planning. This amorphous, unseen enemy was achieving what the RAF's conventional anti-aircraft batteries often could not, the denial of airspace through sheer psychological intimidation. This shift in perception was also reflected in the dark humor and folklore that developed within the Luftwaffe. One bitter joke contrasted the two nations' mindsets: when a Briton says "rifle holder," he means soldier. When a German says the same word, he means enemy. Another common phrase, passed between pilots with a knowing grimness, was, "In Britain, there is no peace. Even the ground shoots at us." Wildly exaggerated stories became part of the mythology, such as the tale of the "old gentleman from Devonshire," a supposed 75-year-old veteran who had allegedly shot down 3 German fighters with his rifle. The story claimed that British authorities had classified the feat to prevent a personality cult from forming. While untrue, the fact that German pilots believed and repeated such tales speaks volumes about the mental space the Home Guard had come to occupy. Let us envision the scene at Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin, October 1940. Hermann Göring is reviewing a map of combat losses. The lowlands of England are dotted with small red flags, each one representing an aircraft lost or damaged on a low-level sortie. His face is grim. A young staff officer reports on the latest incidents: ground fire, civilian resistance, even children are taking up rifles. Göring slowly removes his ostentatious uniform jacket. For the first time, a flicker of doubt, a shadow of uncertainty about the ultimate victory, crosses his face. The laughter had stopped. The transition from ridicule to concern was not merely confined to the cockpits of German aircraft, it soon percolated up to the highest echelons of the Luftwaffe High Command. What had been dismissed as a nuisance was now being recognized as a genuine tactical problem that demanded a formal response. The commanders who had orchestrated lightning victories across Europe were now forced to contend with an enemy they had never anticipated, a civilian population that refused to be terrorized and instead took up arms. At the very top, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring's attitude underwent a significant evolution. Initially, he had publicly and privately scoffed at the Home Guard, viewing them as a pathetic symbol of a decaying empire. However, as reports from his pilots and squadron leaders about unexpected ground fire and inexplicable aircraft damage began to mount, his position was forced to change. The culmination of this was his reluctant issuance of orders to curtail low-altitude attacks. In a moment of unguarded frustration during a meeting with his officers, Göring was reported to have said, "The English are defending themselves like wild beasts. Their civilians are more warlike than many of our own troops." It was a stunning admission from the man who had promised Hitler a swift and total victory in the air. Other senior commanders on the front line shared this growing apprehension. Albert Kesselring, the astute commander of Luftwaffe II, which bore the primary responsibility for the assault on southeastern England, later acknowledged the Home Guard's impact. In his post-war memoirs, he admitted that this armed civilian element created a deeply frustrating, unpredictable factor in the meticulous process of operational planning. A predictable, conventional enemy could be analyzed and countered, a decentralized, seemingly random threat emerging from the very landscape itself could not. This high-level concern translated into direct and specific operational orders. A clear chain of command developed, pilot reports led to squadron-level directives, which were then sanctioned by the High Command. A service memo from one squadron commander, reflecting a now common policy, was starkly explicit: low-flying attacks are forbidden in areas where high activity of ground fire has been registered. To enforce such orders, German intelligence officers were tasked with developing a new and unusual classification system, rating the defensive capabilities of British regions not on the basis of anti-aircraft batteries or RAF sector stations, but on the reported intensity of civilian ground fire. The statistical impact of this new reality was significant. By October 1940, it is estimated that approximately 15% of all planned combat sorties over southern England were either cancelled or had their routes significantly altered specifically to avoid the danger of fire from below. This tactical adaptation reached its logical conclusion in November 1940, when the Luftwaffe issued a secret directive. This order mandated a strategic transition to night operations in the majority of districts in southern England, a move driven as much by the threat from the Home Guard as by the need to evade RAF fighters. A rumored quote, attributed to an unnamed German general, perfectly encapsulates the German command's dawning realization of the depth of British resolve. "If the English lose their army," he supposedly remarked, "they will have their militia. If they lose their militia, their women will fight. If they lose their women, their children will fight. And even if they lose their children, they will fight with their very land." Picture a scene in a forward command post in France. The commander of a Ju-87 Stuka wing, Oberst Werner, sits alone in his office. On his desk are two rifles laid side by side for comparison, a British Lee Enfield and a German Mauser. In front of him is the file of a young pilot, killed not in a dogfight with a Spitfire, but by a single rifle bullet that had torn through the floor of his cockpit. The official report states the cause of death bluntly: killed by a bullet from a ground-based civilian. The Oberst closes his eyes. The war he was trained to fight, a war of machines, strategy, and uniformed soldiers, was over. This was something else entirely. In the crucible of total war, the psychological battlefield is often as important as the physical one. For the German airmen flying over Britain, the constant threat of ground fire gave birth to a powerful and pervasive mythology. Rumors, anecdotes, and outright legends spread through the squadrons, painting a picture of an island where every citizen was a soldier and every village a potential death trap. Separating the factual basis of these stories from the embellishments of fear and propaganda is key to understanding the true psychological impact of this civilian resistance. A number of specific beliefs took hold within the Luftwaffe, each with a different relationship to the truth. The most widespread rumor was that the British have armed every citizen. In reality, this was a myth. While the Home Guard numbered over 1 million men, the supply of weapons and especially ammunition was severely limited. The image of a nation universally armed was far from the truth, but the perception was potent enough to create the impression of a universal threat. Another common belief was that, in England, there are no peaceful villages. This was partially true. While the phenomenon of ground fire was heavily concentrated in the embattled southeastern counties, it was not ubiquitous across the entire country. However, for the pilots whose daily missions took them over this hostile corridor, the distinction was academic. To them, it felt like the entire nation was in revolt. Perhaps the most famous legend was that of grandmothers with shotguns shooting down planes. This was almost certainly folklore, yet it grew from a kernel of truth. Women did participate in the defense of Britain, often in auxiliary roles and sometimes as part of unofficial defense groups. The legend took this reality and amplified it into a symbol of total, almost unnatural, resistance that defied all conventional military logic. In a similar vein, anecdotes about even the church bell ringers being armed circulated not as fact, but as a form of gallows humor that reflected the broader reality of a militarized populace. This mythology was not left to chance, it was actively shaped by both British and German propaganda. The British Ministry of Information deliberately and skillfully fanned the flames of these rumors. Stories of popular resistance were a powerful tool for maintaining domestic morale and demonstrating to the world, particularly the United States, that Britain's will to fight was unbreakable. The contrast with France's swift capitulation was intentionally highlighted, creating a narrative that was entirely true: the French capitulated, the English are rising up. German propaganda, conversely, took the opposite approach in its public-facing messaging. It sought to minimize the significance of the Home Guard, officially dismissing it as a civilian game of war and a sign of British desperation. Yet, this official narrative was completely undermined by the private communications of the men on the front lines. In their personal letters and diaries, German pilots and aircrew acknowledged the very real and terrifying nature of the threat. One officer's letter home starkly summarized the feeling: Churchill has supplied every Briton not only with a rifle, but with hatred for us. This private fear was the truth the official propaganda sought to conceal. This internal conflict gave rise to a unique folklore within the Luftwaffe. One popular German anecdote wryly asked, "What is the true weapon of a Briton? His rifle or his stubbornness?" The phrase, "In England, even the ground shoots at us," became a common, fatalistic expression of the overwhelming nature of the opposition. Imagine a smoke-filled Berlin café, a popular haunt for Luftwaffe pilots on leave. A young flyer, his hands still trembling slightly, recounts a story from his last mission, telling his comrades how he was attacked by what seemed like a whole army of English peasants. The other pilots laugh, but the laughter is brittle, a little too loud. It quickly dies down into a nervous silence. They all know the story is exaggerated, but they also know it is rooted in a shared and terrifying truth. In that moment, they are not laughing at the British, they are laughing at their own fear. By early September 1940, the German High Command faced a strategic crisis. The daylight campaign to destroy the Royal Air Force was failing. Fighter Command, though battered, remained operational, and the Luftwaffe's own losses of aircraft and experienced pilots were becoming unsustainable. A new strategy was needed. The decision, when it came, was a fateful one that would change the character of the war: a shift from tactical daylight raids to strategic night bombing. This transition was driven by a complex set of factors, and among them, the persistent and psychologically draining problem of civilian ground fire played a crucial and often underestimated role. The official turning point came on September 7, 1940. On that day, massive formations of German bombers, for the first time, made the city of London their primary target, unleashing a wave of destruction that marked the beginning of the Blitz. This strategic shift was primarily a response to the effectiveness of the RAF's daylight fighters. By flying under the cover of darkness, German bombers were largely safe from interception by Spitfires and Hurricanes, which at the time lacked effective night fighting capabilities. However, a secondary and vital benefit, frequently noted in the internal service memos of Luftwaffe commanders, was the desire to avoid the unpredictable hail of fire from the ground. Darkness would cloak them not only from the RAF but also from the snipers in every village. The ensuing campaign of terror was relentless. For 57 consecutive nights, from September 7 to November 2, London was bombed. In the first week of this new phase alone, the Luftwaffe dropped over 1 million kilograms of bombs on the city, hoping to shatter civilian morale and force a British capitulation through what they called a strategy of physical and psychological exhaustion. Yet, the move to night operations did not entirely eliminate the threat from the ground. While the darkness protected the bombers from aimed rifle fire, it did not make them silent. The distinctive, throbbing drone of German bomber engines became a familiar and dreaded sound across southern England. In a remarkable display of continued defiance, civilians and Home Guard units refused to be cowed. Using the sound of the engines as their only guide, they would often fire blindly into the night sky. While the chances of hitting a target were astronomically low, the act itself was one of defiance. In some districts, organized night watches were established, with volunteers listening intently for the sound of approaching aircraft, ready to unleash a volley of fire into the darkness. This practice gave rise to its own set of rumors and interpretations. One persistent story claimed that Churchill himself ordered that people should shoot into the sky at night, not with any real hope of hitting a plane, but simply to frighten the Germans with the noise. Whether true or not, the rumor captured the essence of this new phase of resistance, a psychological battle fought with sound and fury, signifying an unbreakable will to fight back by any means necessary, at any hour of the day or night. The move to the Blitz was, therefore, not just a change in Luftwaffe strategy, but also a direct consequence of the total and multi-layered defense they had encountered, a defense that came not only from the sky but from the very ground they sought to dominate. Let us picture the sky over London at 4 p.m. on September 7, 1940. It is the last great daylight raid. Below, on the streets of the East End, amid the smoke and the chaos, ordinary men, dockers, shopkeepers, veterans, point their rifles and Lewis guns skyward and open fire. The bullets may be inaccurate, a mere pinprick against the vast armada above, but their message is unmistakable. They create the overwhelming impression of total resistance. That night, the Luftwaffe will return, hidden by the darkness. They will no longer see the faces of the men below, faces filled with grit and determination, but they will know they are there, listening, waiting. The daylight war was over. Beyond the broad narrative of a nation in arms, the story of civilian resistance is woven from the threads of individual actions and the legends they inspired. While official records are scarce, a pantheon of anonymous heroes and folkloric figures emerged, their stories passed from person to person, becoming powerful symbols of defiance. These tales, existing in the gray area between documented fact and inspirational myth, reveal the deeply personal nature of the fight against the Luftwaffe. In the annals of this unofficial war, certain archetypal figures appear repeatedly. There was the story of the First World War veteran from Dorset, a man whose name has been lost to history but whose alleged feat became legendary. According to the tale, armed with his old service rifle, he single-handedly shot down 2 Messerschmitt fighters. He was the embodiment of the Dad's Army spirit, an old soldier, passed over by the regular army, who brought his hard-won skills to bear on a new enemy in defense of his home. From the neighboring county of Kent came the legend of the Sniper of Kent. This figure was said to be a 60-year-old hunter, a man who had spent his life stalking game in the fields and woods. When the war came to his doorstep, he simply changed his quarry. He reportedly began to hunt German aircraft as if they were wild animals, using his profound knowledge of the local terrain and his skills as a marksman to engage low-flying planes. The resistance was not limited to old soldiers and hunters. It was a total community effort, a fact captured in the story of the local schoolmistress. This unnamed teacher, recognizing that the war was now a reality for even the youngest, reportedly took it upon herself to instruct her pupils on the rules of engagement for firing on low-flying targets. It was a chilling testament to how deeply the fight had permeated the fabric of British life. Alongside these quasi-historical figures, a rich folklore emerged, full of tales that, while perhaps not literally true, captured the spirit of the time. One of the most potent was the legend of the 3 sisters from Somerset, who were said to have brought down a Messerschmitt Bf 109 using only their hunting rifles. Another popular story featured a village priest who transformed his church belfry, a symbol of peace, into a military observation post, using his high vantage point to spot incoming raids and relay information to local defense units. And then there were the anecdotes that celebrated sheer, stubborn defiance over military success, like the tale of the British granny who, seeing a German plane fly low over her garden, supposedly drove it off by furiously waving her umbrella at it. These stories were not born in newspapers or official communiques. They were born in the heart of the community, in the places where people gathered to share news and fears. Imagine an unnamed English pub in the evening, after the sound of the all clear has faded. A group of locals gathers, their faces illuminated by the dim light. An old man, a veteran of the trenches, quietly takes a sip of his ale and says to the man next to him, "Today, "Today I finally got the bastard." His words, a mixture of pride and exhaustion, ripple through the room. By the next day, his claim has become a village rumor. A week later, it is a regional legend. A month later, distorted and magnified, it becomes a myth that crosses the English Channel and appears in the anxious letters German pilots write home, a story of an invincible old man who cannot be defeated. The factual accuracy of his claim was never the point. Its power was in its telling. To fully appreciate the impact of Britain's civilian resistance, one must look beyond the number of confirmed kills and analyze how this unconventional threat fundamentally altered the Luftwaffe's strategic calculations and tactical behavior. While the Home Guard never brought down German aircraft in statistically significant numbers, their true contribution to victory lay in the disruption, degradation, and psychological dislocation of a technologically superior enemy. On a strategic level, the consequences were profound. The persistent danger of ground fire was a significant contributing factor in the Luftwaffe's eventual shift from daylight precision bombing to nighttime area bombing. This transition, while terrifying for civilians, was a strategic defeat for Germany. It effectively conceded the daytime skies to the RAF, allowing fighter command's crucial infrastructure, its airfields, command centers, and radar stations, to survive and recover. Furthermore, the need for German planners to identify and avoid entire regions of southern England due to the intensity of civilian fire severely reduced their operational flexibility. Flight plans became more complex and less efficient, introducing an element of uncertainty that plagued every mission. The cumulative psychological effect of a total resistance influenced decisions at the highest levels, forcing commanders to become more cautious and risk-averse. These strategic pressures were the direct result of tangible tactical changes forced upon German aircrews. The most immediate and common reaction to ground fire was for pilots to increase their flight altitude. While this simple maneuver offered a degree of protection, it came at a steep cost, a significant reduction in bombing accuracy. A higher-flying bomber is a safer bomber, but it is also a far less effective one. In addition to this, mission planners on the ground had to engage in the complex process of route coordination, plotting flight paths that deliberately bypassed known hotbeds of Home Guard activity. Finally, on the occasions when low-level attacks were deemed essential, they now required a much heavier fighter escort to suppress ground fire, tying up valuable Messerschmitts that were desperately needed elsewhere. When viewed through a quantitative lens, the effectiveness of this resistance becomes even clearer. Post-war estimates by British officials suggested that a modest 2 to 5% of total Luftwaffe losses could be directly or indirectly attributed to ground fire. However, the psychological impact was vastly greater. It is estimated that at least 10 to 15% of German pilots reported actively changing their behavior in the air, flying higher, taking evasive action, or avoiding certain areas, specifically because of the perceived threat from below. The strategic investment was also remarkably efficient. The cost of a single modern Luftwaffe bomber was roughly equivalent to the cost of 10,000 Lee Enfield rifles. By this logic, if the fire from thousands of rifles contributed to the loss of even one enemy aircraft, the investment had already paid for itself many times over. Imagine a German intelligence officer standing before an operational map of southeastern England. The routes of his bombers are not the straight, efficient lines of a confident aggressor. Instead, they are jagged, broken, and contorted, bending unnaturally to circumvent entire districts. Each deviation represents a loss of time, a waste of fuel, and a decrease in tactical effectiveness. He stares at this unsettling, distorted map and understands a terrifying truth. The enemy he was fighting was not just the RAF fighters in the sky. The enemy was everywhere on the ground below. Years after the guns fell silent, the story of the armed civilians who took on the Luftwaffe remains a subject of intense historical debate. The precise contribution of the Home Guard to the outcome of the Battle of Britain is not a settled matter. Instead, historians have offered a range of compelling, and often conflicting, interpretations. These debates explore whether the Dad's Army was a genuine military asset, a powerful psychological tool, or a masterstroke of wartime mythology. One prominent school of thought argues for the exaggeration of its role. These historians contend that the material impact of the Home Guard was minimal and that its successes were deliberately inflated by British propaganda. They point out that the number of aircraft verifiably shot down by civilian fire was infinitesimally small compared to the totals claimed by the RAF. From this perspective, the stories of snipers in Kent and grandmothers with shotguns were primarily morale-boosting fictions, valuable for the war effort but not a reflection of military reality. In direct contrast is the psychological victory argument. Proponents of this view concede that the physical damage inflicted by the Home Guard was small, but they assert that its true value was immeasurable. They argue that the primary effect of this citizen resistance was psychological, creating a pervasive sense of fear and uncertainty among German aircrews and commanders. This constant, low-level threat, they claim, subtly degraded Luftwaffe effectiveness, forced tactical changes, and contributed to the strategic decision to abandon daylight raids. In this interpretation, the Home Guard won not by destroying planes, but by winning the battle for the minds of their enemies. A third group of historians sees the Home Guard primarily in terms of its strategic potential. They focus less on what the force did during the Battle of Britain and more on what it represented. For them, the Home Guard was the ultimate, last line of defense, the manifestation of Britain's will to resist an invasion. Its true purpose was to be a massive, decentralized insurgency force that would have bled the Wehrmacht dry in every town and village had Operation Sea Lion been launched. In this light, its skirmishes with the Luftwaffe were merely a prelude to its primary, and ultimately untested, role. Finally, some scholars view the entire phenomenon through the lens of wartime mythology. They argue that the story of the Home Guard became a foundational myth for wartime Britain, a powerful narrative of national unity, democratic defiance, and plucky resolve against overwhelming odds. The individual stories and legends were less important as factual accounts and more valuable as components of a national epic that helped to steel the British people for the long war ahead. These debates have been fueled by the gradual release of official documents. After the war, the British government declassified records that appeared to support the skeptical view, showing that the number of confirmed aircraft kills by the Home Guard was far lower than the propaganda had implied. However, more recent access to German archives has, in turn, revealed that the threat of ground fire was taken far more seriously by the Luftwaffe than Western historians had previously assumed. These German records lend weight to the psychological victory thesis. Furthermore, modern military analysis, while confirming that conventional anti-aircraft systems were more effective, also suggests that widespread, low-caliber ground fire was more disruptive and damaging than earlier studies had believed. Picture a round table of historians, decades after the war. The table is littered with documents, letters, and grainy photographs. They argue over figures, eyewitness accounts, and the lingering echoes of wartime rumors. One historian produces a declassified British report minimizing the Home Guard's impact. Another counters with a translated Luftwaffe memo expressing grave concern over civilian fire. A third tells a story that has long since passed from personal testimony into national legend. As is so often the case with history, the absolute truth remains elusive, hidden somewhere in the middle, shrouded in a fog of time and memory. The final verdict on the Home Guard's role in the Battle of Britain came not from British historians or propagandists, but from the very men who had once mocked them. In the quiet reflection of the post-war years, the initial derision that Luftwaffe commanders and pilots had felt towards Dad's army transformed into a deep and abiding respect. The laughter had long since faded, replaced by the sober acknowledgement of an enemy whose true strength was not in its weapons, but in its indomitable spirit. This profound shift in perspective is vividly captured in the memoirs and interviews of former Luftwaffe officers. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had commanded the air fleets that assaulted England, wrote with the clarity of hindsight, "We underestimated the will to resist of the British people. Even their old men fought with a courage worthy of real soldiers." This was no longer the language of contempt for a theatrical army, but the professional respect of one soldier for another. The sentiment was echoed by those who had fought in the skies. "We laughed at Dad's army, but in the end, they were defeating us," recalled former pilot Werner Schumacher in an interview. "Not directly, but by influencing our strategy, our psyche, our decisions." This newfound respect manifested in remarkable ways after the war. In an extraordinary gesture of reconciliation, a number of former German pilots traveled to Britain to meet the very men who had fired upon them from the ground. These encounters were not marked by lingering animosity, but by a sense of shared experience and mutual admiration between former foes. The academic world also took notice. In the 1960s, a respected German historical journal published a series of articles dedicated to analyzing the Home Guard, acknowledging them as a significant and unexpected opponent, who had played a crucial role in the conflict. Perhaps the most succinct summary of this changed perception is captured in a story that circulated in military circles after the war. A German general, in conversation with a British officer, was said to have made a startling comparison: "Your militia was more dangerous to us than your fighters. Because the fighters followed the laws of war, but the militia followed the law of freedom." Imagine a television studio. Years after the war. An elderly German officer, his face a map of his memories, sits before a camera for an interview about the Battle of Britain. The interviewer asks him what he truly thinks now about the civilian resistance he once faced. The old man pauses, his eyes looking at something far away. "We were wrong," he says, his voice quiet but firm. "We were wrong when we laughed at the bold men with rifles. They did not surrender. They did not capitulate. They showed us what true resistance is." He leans forward slightly, his gaze intense. Maybe it was not a military victory, but it was a moral victory. And in the end, a moral victory is more important than any armament.